Oldwood presents The Housekeeper's Promise, written by Evelyn Hood and read by Abby Andrews. To the people of Paisley, past and present. Prologue. The town hospital had been built in 1752 to house Paisley's poor. It seemed to Elizabeth, as she tried in vain to scrub the scuffed parlour floor in 1828, that nobody else had attempted to clean it in the intervening 76 years. The scrubbing brush was a poor mess of bristles and wood, the water she worked with cool and scummy, adding its own dirt to the filthy floor. The soap, harsh yellow stuff made in the hospital kitchen, had vanished. "Teeny!" She sat back on her heels, pushed lank hair from her eyes, glared at the elderly women kneeling beside her. "Give me that soap!" Teeny worked on, scrubbing as though intent on wearing her way through to the foundations of the building, but Elizabeth's sharp eyes had seen the yellow lump in Teeny's almost closed fist. The woman was a known thief. She took everything she saw, and if she couldn't sell it for a few pence, she hid it in the garden. "Give it to me!" Elizabeth launched herself at Teeny, who was caught by surprise. The two of them rolled on the wet, dirty floor, Teeny squawking in childish outrage, Elizabeth silent, fighting with tooth and nail, feet and fists. If the soap went missing, it would mean yet another punishment. This time, surely, she would be made to spend an hour in the cells where the insane folk were kept. The thought of it made her skin crawl, and she redoubled her efforts. She had just gained hold of the precious soap when fingers dug into her scalp, dragging her head back as tears flooded into her screwed-up eyes. The soap slid from her hand, and she and Teeny were separated. "Elizabeth Cunningham!" Mistress Jameson, matron of the hospital, glared down at her. "I might have known it! Get to the kitchen this minute and wait for me!" "She stole the soap and I never did!" Teeny shrieked, then fled to the corner of the empty, gloomy parlour as Elizabeth rounded on her. "That's enough!" the matron rapped. Then another voice, low and calm, spoke from the doorway. "And how old is this lassie?" 14 years, Mistress Montgomery." The matron released her grip on Elizabeth, who stood where she was, Teeny forgotten. "Old enough to go into service." Mistress Montgomery came further into the room, lifting her skirts to keep them away from the muddy floor. "She's of some use in the kitchens and with the younger children, and most folk feel she doesn't have the looks or the proper manner to be a servant." Elizabeth's cheeks flamed, and she opened her mouth to protest that she wasn't an animal to be discussed as though she had no feelings. Then she remembered the cells and closed her lips. 2 hours at least for a girl who had the audacity to answer back before a visitor. Instead, she tilted her chin defiantly, determined that she wasn't going to lower her head. To her surprise, her brown gaze met grey eyes filled with warmth and interest. There was even sympathy there, though it was an emotion she hadn't seen often before. Mistress Montgomery wore a fine dark red silk gown and a feathered bonnet. Greying brown hair framed a pretty face that looked as though it smiled easily. About her shoulders was one of the beautiful, intricately patterned shawls woven on Paisley looms and famed throughout the world. "Is your mother in the hospital?" The question was directed at Elizabeth herself, subtle reproof to the matron, who drew in her breath with a faint hiss, but said nothing. "She's—" Elizabeth swallowed hard. "They died of the smallpox, my mother and father and Davy. And the laughing baby." In the 7 lonely years since, she had demanded of Mistress Jameson's God over and over again why she had been made to stay alive without them. Her face coloured again as she saw the woman's eyes travel over the scar that stretched from one corner of her mouth to the angle of her jaw. Many people in Paisley carried smallpox scars, but Elizabeth felt as though the uneven, puckered groove she bore was the ugliest ever seen. "But you survived it. You were meant for a long life," Mistress Montgomery said gently. "Tell me," Elizabeth Cunningham, would you be willing to work for me?" Mistress Jameson moved forward swiftly. "I really think you should see the girl I've selected for you." Mistress Montgomery held up an elegant hand, her eyes still on Elizabeth's face. "I require a girl who can learn to manage a household and perhaps become my companion. Would you like that?" "Aye." The word was no more than a strangled gasp, but it spoke volumes. A smile told Elizabeth that the woman understood. "Someone of a more placid disposition." The matron tried to intervene, and the smile deepened. "My dear woman, a more placid disposition would be quite bewildered in a household of men," said Mistress Montgomery, crisply. "I require someone with some spirit, and I think we'll both be well pleased. You can send her to the High Street tomorrow, and I think, under the circumstances, that it would be a kindness to forget today's misdemeanour." She swept out with a rustle of silk, followed by Mistress Jameson, with a clank of keys. The soap vanished within the folds of Teeny's greasy, shabby gown, and she gave the bucket a slight kick, setting the floor awash with spilled water, soaking Elizabeth's worn shoes. Elizabeth didn't care. On the following morning, she stood in the town hospital's front hall, her face scrubbed until it glowed painfully, her hair washed and screwed into plaits and hidden beneath a respectable white linen cap. Her sole possessions, a change of clothing, and a Bible, were in the bundle she held. Mistress Jameson surveyed her from every angle before coming to a standstill before her. "I want you to know, Elizabeth Cunningham, that Mistress Rachel Montgomery is the wife of one of Paisley's most important manufacturers. You must never, never—" A large knuckled forefinger wagged before Elizabeth's nose. "Never do anything to anger her or her man. If you bring shame on this institution by your bad behaviour or disobedience or impudence, the Lord himself will strike you down. Do you mind me?" Elizabeth, too overcome to speak, nodded violently. "May he go with you." The matron finished, in a voice that said plainly that she was sure he had more to do than go with the likes of Elizabeth Cunningham, orphan and troublemaker. The hospital doors opened. Elizabeth took a firm grip on her bundle and walked out to face a new life. Chapter 1. Rounding the corner from New Street into High Street, Elizabeth staggered and gasped as the wind caught at her cloak. She staggered again when an elderly woman pushed by her roughly, intent on getting out of the gale. In some alehouse, to judge from the smell that hit Elizabeth's nose in the passing. The summer of 1831 was whirling itself out of existence with ill-tempered grace. Well, it might, for it had been a bad summer for Paisley. Scotland's most successful weaving centre had too many looms lying idle and too many hungry weavers seeking work.
"Mind the store, lassie."
A plump-coloured arm with lace at the wrist swept out to hold Elizabeth back from the gutter, which swirled with filthy water. The man smiled down at her as she regained her balance and stammered thanks. Then he disappeared into the tide of folks sweeping along the high street in both directions. The footpaths were packed with housewives, barefooted children oblivious to the cold, plump businessmen with gold chains looped securely across ample stomachs. The narrow roadway, too, had its traffic. Carts and carriages, mail gigs, men on horseback swearing at pedestrians who crossed beneath the very noses of the horses. It was just as well, Elizabeth thought, as she looped the basket more firmly over her arm and battled on her way, that she hadn't much further to go. And there it was, the fine, solid oaken door, proclaiming in the gleam of its handle and knocker that it belonged to a prosperous man. It swung open under her hand, then closed behind her, shutting out the noise and the wind. As always, she felt a faint thrill of pleasure when she stood in the hallway of Rab Montgomery's fine house. It had an air of opulence that she had never known until 3 years before. Normally, she would have scurried down the narrow passage that led down the side of the house to the back door, but now and then, when she knew her employer wasn't at home, She permitted herself the luxury of using the front door and pretending that the house belonged to her. In reality, the only part that could be said to be hers was the kitchen. Elizabeth enjoyed her moment of pride, then crossed to the door set in the shadows beyond the staircase. The kitchen of the Montgomery house was a large room, stone-flagged and, at that moment, rich with a mixture of aromas from pots bubbling on the range. The big scrubbed wooden table that took up most of the floor space was packed with platters carrying crisp golden tarts, sugared cakes, cold meats, and loaves crusty and hot from the oven. Such a banquet had to be prepared for that night. Several neighbours and one of the baker's shops nearby had been called on to lend their ovens for the occasion. It was a sight guaranteed to gladden the heart of any housewife, but Elizabeth's attention was immediately taken from the table by the noise of Tibby's scolding and Jean's sobs. "What's amiss?" She found a stool to hold her laden basket and unfastened her tartan cloak. "Well, you might ask." Tibby, a small shrew of a woman, rounded on her, hands tucked into her skinny waist. "It's thon stupid big lump of a lassie. Why, you keep her on here's beyond me." Jean huddled in a chair with her apron over her face, howled like a banshee. Cold terror caught at Elizabeth's heart. "She's gone and let the beef burn. Jane, did I not tell you time and again to keep your eyes on that beef? It's no the beef." Tibby made it sound as though burning the beef counted as a very small sin. "What then?" Elizabeth anxiously studied the table as Jean bayed to the smoky ceiling like a dog serenading the moon. "The puddings? What happened to the puddings?" The perfect housekeeper. She was more concerned over her employer's favourite foods than anything else. Rab Montgomery had spent days ordering this meal, and he was a hard taskmaster if he was crossed. "The puddings haven't come from Mistress McNair's kitchen yet. This daft gawk. You can't leave her to do anything." Tibby nudged Jean, bringing another howl from her. Elizabeth, now almost beside herself with worry, dragged the apron down and revealed a swollen, turkey-red face. "Then what's she done? In the name of reason, Jean, will you just tell me what's gone wrong?"
"Oh, Miss Elizabeth."
Jean gulped, sniffed, and was about to slip into a fresh bout of keening when a look at Elizabeth's face made her change her mind.
"I can't mind if I salted the broth or no."
"Is that all?" "All?" Tibby squawked self-righteously. "And me standing at that table for near on 2 hours chopping and cutting so that they'd have the best broth ever put on a table to welcome a wanderer home." "Did you think to taste the broth?" They stared at her blankly, and Elizabeth found a wooden spoon, dipped it into the huge pot on the sway that held it over the range, and blew the soup cautiously before tasting it. "Aye, you salted it, Jane." She waited, unkindly, for the first look of relief to spread over the scullery maid's face before going on. "Twice. Now see here," she added swiftly, as Jane's face screwed up again and Tibby opened her mouth for another scolding. "Crying'll no cure it. Tears are salty too. Away, and get more water for the kettle while I see to this." She seized a cloth, lifted the heavy kettle that was always simmering on the range, and tipped some of it into the broth pot. "You'll ruin it!" Tibby danced about the kitchen in a frenzy. Elizabeth tasted the mixture again. "It's still got a good flavour to it, and there's enough to drink if the salt makes him thirsty. They'll no complain." Tibby jerked a white-capped head in the direction of the open back door. "Why you keep that lassie on here's beyond me. She hasn't got as much sense as would fill a flea. She can manage well enough when she's no being hurried." Elizabeth raced to the maid's defence. The truth was that Jean, like herself, had been brought up in the town hospital. Orphan must help orphan. Elizabeth knew well enough that Tibby, who worked in her brother's butcher's shop, would have preferred Jean's job and never missed the opportunity, when helping out, to show up the girl's shortcomings. Jean staggered in from the darkening night with a stoup of water from the outside well in each hand. Elizabeth directed her to refill the kettle and to wash her tear-stained face, then hurried to the parlour, rolling up her sleeves as she went. to make sure that everything was prepared for the evening celebrations. The room was a flickering patchwork of light and shadows in the firelight. She drew the heavy curtains, lit a taper at the fire, and attended to the lamps. The parlour was large and well furnished, with good pieces chosen by Rab Montgomery's late wife. The carpet, soft underfoot, was in muted shades of blue and green and brown. Elizabeth crossed the hall and peeped in at the door of the dining room, nodding her satisfaction over the big table's snowy, starched covering and the discreet glitter of glass and silverware. This room was hardly ever used. Since Rab had been widowed almost a year before, he and his sons preferred to take their morning meal in the kitchen and their evening meals at the small table in the parlour. The knocker rattled importantly, and as soon as Elizabeth answered it, Christian Selby swept into the hall on a gust of cold air and a handful of rain. She divested herself of her fur-trimmed cloak, revealing a lilac silk dress with a lace-edged ruff about the neck and full lace-trimmed sleeves. "Well, Elizabeth," she unfastened her bonnet strings and took the hat off, patting the fine lace cap that hid most of her grey-streaked dark head. "Is everyone at home? Mr. Montgomery's gone to meet the coach." Christian tutted and smoothed the skirt of her gown with a beringed hand. She was a small, plump, active woman, warm-hearted and generous, quite unlike her dour cousin, Rab Montgomery. "No doubt he'll catch the pneumonia, and Adam will find he only came home to attend a deathbed. Mind you, he'll probably be cosy enough in Sadie's tavern, waiting for the coach in comfort, with a drink in his hand. What about Matthew and James?" "Not home yet." Elizabeth allowed her fingers the luxury of a swift wriggle in the thick fur that lined the cloak Christian had handed to her. It would be dreary in the big warehouse by the river on a stormy night like this. She could picture the lamps casting weird shadows in the corners and on the high ceilings above the bundles and bales. Matthew and James Montgomery would be the last to leave as usual, Matthew with his brain buzzing over the figuring he hated, James, in a dream of his own, working out a new poem or a new design in his head. Christian brought her back to her own business with a bump when she said briskly, "Well, we'd best be saying to things," and bustled off to the kitchen. "Ma'am, Mistress Selby," Elizabeth scurried after her. "Would you not be more comfortable in the parlour?" Christian tutted. "Lassie, maybe I'm here to preside over this party for Rab, but you'd surely never expect me to sit alone in the parlour till the folk came." She threw the kitchen door open. "Good evening to you, Jane. You're here too, Tibby." In a moment, she had cast an eye over the table, swung the broth pot out from the fire, and peeped inside, muttering to herself all the time. Born to money and widowed by a well-to-do husband, Christian had inherited the character of her grandmother, a weaver's wife. She was used to servants, but she had no time for a woman who knew nothing of the workings of a kitchen or the right way to apply a poultice or darn a stocking. Her father had been a surgeon, her brother a lawyer, her husband a banker. It was Christian's belief that she could have bettered any of them if she had not had the misfortune to be born a woman. "I see the fatted calf's been killed for the prodigal son," she observed dryly, unfastening her sleeves and rolling them back to expose rounded, capable forearms. "Elizabeth, a clean penny, if you please." A rap at the back door heralded the arrival of Mistress McNair's small maid with the sweet puddings. Suddenly, all the last-minute arrangements became essential, and by the time everything was ready, Elizabeth had reason to be grateful for Christian's calm, efficient organisation. "You're on the young side to be giving orders to the likes of Tibby." Christian brushed words of appreciation aside as she led Elizabeth back to the parlour, fastening her sleeves again. "She's lazy, and she needs someone who's ready for her. It's foolish of Rab to expect you to see to everything. He should have had the sense to employ an older woman." Then, realising that her words sounded critical, she added kindly, "After all, poor Rachel engaged you to be her companion, not the housekeeper." Rachel Montgomery, Rab's second wife and mother to James and Matthew, had died almost a year earlier, and Elizabeth missed her warmth and her guidance bitterly. But there was no time to think of that now. The front door opened and closed, and Christian, tidying her hair in the mirror above the mantel, whirled round. "They're here! Rab! Adam!" Then her voice flattened with disappointment. "Oh, it's you, James." James Montgomery, youngest of Rab's 3 sons and 21 years of age, blinked in surprise at his cousin. "Are you here already?" "Already?" she screeched at him. "The guest's arriving at any minute, and Adam late. Have you no idea of the time? James Montgomery, get upstairs this minute and get yourself into a decent coat and cravat, else your father'll have something to say when he gets home." Placid James, who always gave the impression that his thoughts were elsewhere, gave her his sweet, warm smile and turned away obediently. "Wait! Where's Matthew?" she rapped, and he looked around as though slightly surprised to realise that he had come home alone. "Oh, yes, he's calling in at Shuttle Street," he remembered. His kinswoman raised her eyes to the ceiling. "Does he have to go courting tonight of all nights? Off you go, James," she added, shooing him across the hall as though he was a stray chicken. Then she bustled back into the parlour. "Mind you, I see no reason why Isabel couldn't have been invited here tonight with Matt. Nobody ever ended something by pretending it wasn't there. Isabel's a fine lassie. Rab's a fool. His son could find a worse wife." The knocker banged, and Elizabeth hurried to the hall, rushed back to the parlour in answer to Christian's skreek of horror, caught the rejected penny as the older woman tore it off and threw it at her, then ran back to open the door. She returned to the kitchen just as the back door opened, frightening the life out of Jean, who had been leaning against it. "Beth!" Matthew seized her hands in an icy grip, his nose red from the cold wind. "Are they here yet?" "No, but due any minute. Your cousin Christian's entertaining the Blairs in the parlour. You're awful late, Matt." His light brown hair was windswept. "I saw the Blairs at the door, so I came down the side passage. I'll get upstairs and get ready." He picked up a pastry, ignoring her angry "Matthew Montgomery," and slid like a shadow through the inner door. Tibby, stirring the broth, sniffed. "There's no way for a young gentleman to behave. Stealing through his father's back door like a thief. Mind you, there's some say that he's no keeping the right company these days." "You can see to the potatoes now." Elizabeth found a new hardness in her voice to make the woman subside. Christian was right. Tibby did need to be bullied before she would mind her sharp tongue. Elizabeth had a soft spot for Matt, for she knew he was unhappy working as his father's warehouse foreman. And Isabel Gibson, Matthew's love, was a friend of Elizabeth's. Isabel's father was a silk weaver, now old and unable to do much work. Isabel herself worked for the Montgomerys, trimming shawls for 1 shilling and 3 a day. Rab had made it clear that he didn't consider her a good match for his son. The door knocker thumped again, and again, and again. Matthew and James, both neat and well-groomed, appeared among the guests. The parlour was full, the meal ready. But still, Rab Montgomery and his eldest son Adam, the guest of honour, were missing. "I mind Adam was never good at arriving anywhere on time," Christian remarked to Mrs. Andrew Blair. As Elizabeth went into the parlour for advice, "He took 3 days to his own birth, and his mother never survived it, poor flower. What's amiss, Elizabeth?" The meat was amiss, beginning to sizzle ominously in its own shrinking fat, and the potatoes weren't ready for eating. "Could I serve the meal now, ma'am?" "You can't put the food on the table before the master of the house is here, not to mention—" Christian's head lifted sharply. "Did I hear the front door? They're here!" Her shrill voice caught everyone's attention. It was too late for Elizabeth to slip back to the kitchen, so she had to stay with the others and await Adam Montgomery's entrance. He had been away from home for some years, and Elizabeth had never set eyes on him. She would have preferred to be well out of the way for his reintroduction to Paisley. All heads turned towards the door, and Rab Montgomery, arriving on the threshold of his own parlour, wet, cold, and in a very bad temper, found himself the centre of some 24 pairs of eyes. "You can all stop staring," he informed his guests curtly. "He's no here." "No here?" Christian, a miniature Moses, divided the throng with little effort, clawing a path to her cousin. "The stage didn't arrive!" Rab let his damp coat fall to the floor and scowled at the gathering. Mrs. Andrew Blair gasped and fluttered a hand to her throat. She was known to be a highly strung lady.
"Here? Of course the stage is here, women,"
Rab snarled.
"A good hour late, and with Adam's boxes on board."
"Marcy!" quavered Mrs. Andrew Blair. "He's fell off!" Rab gave her a withering glance and pushed his way to the small cupboard where the whiskey was kept. Ignoring the buzz of speculation that rose about his ears, he poured himself a generous glassful and drained half of it before speaking.
"He left the coach on the outskirts of the town. It seems that some drunken fool of a man let himself fall under the horses, and Adam undertook to tend him. As to where he is..."
His small blue eyes, bloodshot and bright in his round red face, were like glass as he looked at them all over the rim of the tumbler. When he lowered it again, he went on.
"I have no idea, and damn me if I care."
"We'll have the dinner now." Christian's voice cut decisively across the babble of shocked, alarmed voices. "Elizabeth!" Everyone turned with relief towards their hostess. Everyone except Rab, who emptied his glass and picked up the bottle.
"Aye, off you go to the trough,"
he told his guests with his customary surliness.
"That's what you came for, was it no? For myself, I'll just have a wee dram."
His arm was seized by a plump, determined fist. Its partner took the glass from his hand. "You'll just come through and sit at the table with the rest of us, Rab," Christian ordered. "For you're more in need of hot food than a drink on a stormy night like this." She was the only person, now that his wife was dead, who could make Rab Montgomery do anything against his will. The two of them warred whenever they met, but Christian kept Rab's household going and his life in order. Muttering beneath his breath, he allowed her to lead him to the dining room, followed by the people who had come to welcome Adam home. The meal was more like a wake, with Adam's empty chair reproaching them all. Some of the guests, who had indeed come for the food, gave a good account of themselves. Rab, a big man who had never been known for his cheerfulness and who had become even more soured since Rachel's death, picked morosely at the contents of his plate and devoted more time to the wine, not opening his mouth to anyone. He had planned this evening to the finest degree, and by missing it, Adam had spurned him. Matt, deeply disappointed by his brother's absence, also picked at his food. As she bustled round the table, serving people and making sure that all was in order, Elizabeth caught his blue eyes and was rewarded with a smile. She knew that Matt was wishing that Isabel could be at his side. James worked valiantly to entertain the guests, though all he wanted was to get away to the peace of the small room he shared with Matt. He too had dreams. In James's case, they were about books of poetry or fine shawl designs. Like Matt, he found that his ambitions were scorned by his father. The guests didn't stay for long once the meal was ended. Christian was the last to go. "I have it in mind to hold a wee gathering for some of the younger folk soon," she murmured to Matt as he escorted her to her carriage. "I'd like fine if Isabel would come to it." His face flushed, and he beamed at her gratefully.
That'd be fine."
Gratitude hampered his tongue. Rab and James were in the hall with Elizabeth when Matt went back indoors.
"I'll wait up. Maybe Adam will come home tonight."
Rab rounded on him.
"You'll go to your room and get a good night's sleep. There's plenty to be done at the warehouse in the morning. And I'll have you ready for it. No sleeping over the books because your laggardly brother's so fit to go off with some drunken fool. He can sleep at the house end till the doors open in the morning."
Rab locked the door firmly.
"That might teach him a lesson, if he troubles himself to come home at all."
And he stumped upstairs, dragging the leg that had been injured during the riots 11 years earlier. Matt and James, exchanging looks, followed him. Tibby and Jean helped Elizabeth to clear the table and set the house to rights. A great deal of food had been left over, and Tibby went off home with a bundle beneath her shawl, her shrill tongue sweetened at last. As Elizabeth shut and bolted the back door behind her, She thought of the missing Adam Montgomery. The wind was still strong, and it was raining heavily. She sent Jane off to sleep in the cupboard-like bedroom off the kitchen and decided, tired though she was, to sit up for a little longer, just in case Adam Montgomery arrived home. She couldn't bear to think of him having to huddle in the shelter of a wall till morning. After all, Rab Montgomery hadn't forbidden her to stay up. The rest of the house was in darkness now, but the kitchen was lit and cosy. The kettle simmered quietly on the range. Rain tapped now and then at the window, and the wind howled round the trees in the garden. Elizabeth's lids drooped, lifted, drooped, and settled. She woke with a start, bewildered to find herself in the kitchen, confused by the noise that identified itself as she blinked drowsiness away, as a thunderous attack on the front door. Still not fully clear as to why she wasn't in her bed, she snapped up a lamp and scuttled into the hall, the light chasing shadows before her. Someone was pounding the solid oaken door with determined fists and adding a kick now and then. Elizabeth, hurrying to answer, recalled the fiasco of a few hours before and the missing man. She set the lamp down on a carved straight-back chair and reached up to slide back the bolt at the top of the door. As soon as the bolts were drawn and the latch lifted, the door was thrown back, Elizabeth staggering with it. Then the handle was torn from her fingers as the door was slammed shut again, closing out the wind and rain. A large shape, a man in heavy coat and tall hat, his chin tucked close to his chest, and his coat collar pulled well up, surged into the hall.
"God's teeth!"
boomed an angry voice as the door slammed shut.
"Is everyone deaf in this place? Must a traveller take the very walls apart before he's hurt?"
Flickering lamplight stilled and grew as the air settled again. Its glow illuminated Rab Montgomery's slippered feet and bare ankles below his nightshirt as he stopped on the third bottom step of the staircase. His own candle, held high, lit his face and his night-capped head. Behind him, Elizabeth could hear Matt and James in the shadows.
"Adam!"
Matt whooped, but Rab's sturdy body blocked the way down as he stood still, glaring at his errant son. Adam Montgomery took his hat off and tossed it onto a table, peering up into the candlelit area above.
"Matthew, Father, James,"
he acknowledged his family crisply. In the uncertain light, Rab's face was drawn into a malevolent scowl.
"So you found your way back home after all?"
he said sourly, making no move to come down the last few steps.
"I was, detained. Wait hard. No doubt I'll see you in the morning, if you've nowhere better you'd rather be."
Rab sneered and turned to go back to bed. When Matt and James stood back to let him pass, he barked at them.
"I'll have no family reunions at this time of the night. Get to your beds. You can speak to your brother in the morning."
Reluctantly, the two were driven before him to the upper floor, leaving Elizabeth and Adam in the hall.
"Well, do you mean to let me stand here all night?"
He turned on her. All she could see of him was a face set in lines as uncompromising as Rab's, and broad shoulders that shone wetly. Hurriedly, she bobbed a curtsy and led the way to the kitchen. He ducked his head to follow her through the door, then looked round as he unfastened his caped travelling coat. He let it drop to the floor, in a gesture similar to his father's earlier, and went to spread large, long-fingered hands before the range, shivering.
"Is there food in this place?"
She realised that she had been standing, gaping like a fool. Of course, there's broth I'll heat for you, and some cold fowl, and..." He tore a handful of bread from a loaf on the table, delved into the butter crook, and spread the bread liberally.
"And hot water. I'm in sore need of good hot water,"
he ordered thickly through a mouthful of food. Nervously, Elizabeth fetched a piece of her own soap and a basin, which was promptly tossed into a corner.
"A decent wash, woman, not a dipping of my fingers," he barked at her. "Is there no bath in this god-forsaken house of my father's?"
She opened a door and dragged out the tin-hip bath, struggling with it to the door.
"Now what are you doing?"
I'm taking the bath to your room. Her tongue wouldn't shape the words properly.
You'd have me wash in a cold room on a night like this."
The bath was taken from her and deposited before the fire. The steaming kettle was emptied into it, followed by a pot of water that had been sitting on the range. There was about 2 inches of hot water in the bottom of the bath.
"God save us. There's enough for a sparrow,"
he said in disgust. "There's the water heating in the wash-house for the morning's washing," she ventured, hanging the soup pot on the iron sway and swinging it over the fire.
"Then hold the light for me."
Adam opened the back door and plunged out into the night, Elizabeth close behind him. The wash-house, which held the big copper boiler, was built at right angles to the back of the house and had its own door, close to the kitchen door. He picked up 2 buckets, scooped warm water from the boiler, and returned to hurl their contents into the bath. By the time he was finished, the boiler was almost empty, and the kitchen was fragrant with the aroma of hot broth. Adam grunted with satisfaction as he surveyed the hip bath, half filled with warm water. "Will you eat first?" Elizabeth had set a corner of the table with cutlery and food. He studied it hungrily, then looked down at his own untidy, mud-splashed figure.
"I'll take the edge off my appetite, for the hunger's gnawing at me," he decided,
flicking a contemptuous finger at the bottle of his father's prized brandy she had set out for him.
"You can take that away. Get me a jug of good Scots ale, woman."
She ladled out broth, fetched the ale jug, and ran to put a warming pan in his bed. Adam was to use the small room at the far end of the upstairs passage. When she returned with towels, he had emptied the soup pot and the jug. He indicated to her to bring more ale, then she retired to a chair by the fire, waiting for his next instructions. He ate swiftly, greedily, with his eyes fixed on his plate, and after a moment she dared to look up at him. His clothes were good. A dark red coat, a yellow satin waistcoat, fawn trousers and sturdy boots, with a black cravat at his throat. The boots and trousers were covered in muddy streaks, the coat splashed with darker stains that could have been blood. His dark hair was neither dressed nor powdered, but left free to curl strongly about his forehead and the nape of his neck. His face was square, rugged, handsome, though set in forbidding lines. His eyes, she realised with sudden confusion, were looking straight into hers. Flustered, she fluttered her fingers together in her lap. "And what do they call you?" "Elizabeth?" Her voice came out in a gasp. He pushed his chair back and stood up.
"Well now, Elizabeth, you may have saved my very life with your broth."
He moved to the fire, leaving her free to go to the table to begin gathering up the used dishes.
"You sleep here, in the house?"
"In the attic." She nodded to the door of Jean's little room. "The scullery maid sleeps in there." He dropped his stained coat onto a chair, began to unfasten the buttons of his waistcoat.
"She must be a heavy sleeper tonight, if she isn't dead."
Once her eyes closed, Jean wouldn't know if the house fell down about her ears. Elizabeth attempted a laugh, but it died before the unsmiling scrutiny from the man who stood in the kitchen as though he owned everything in it. The cravat dropped from his nimble fingers, followed by the waistcoat.
"Maybe it's time you were going to your own bed, Elizabeth."
But it didn't seem right. This was no welcome for a man who had been away from home for so long and had travelled so far. But Adam, it seemed, was as uninterested in convention as his father. He was unfastening the pleated cuffs of his shirt, popping buttonholes from neck to waist. Then the shirt, too, was tossed carelessly to the chair. His smooth, muscular torso gleamed in the lamplight as he let the garment fall and straightened up again.
"Unless,"
he suggested, as his fingers moved unhurriedly, but with purpose, to the buttons at the waistband of his tight-fitting trousers,
"you have some notion of giving me your own welcome home. You must forgive me if I devote myself to my bath first. Or are you gifted like those famous geisha girls of Japan?"
Elizabeth didn't want to hear any more. With a scandalised gasp, realising that he had no intention of letting her presence prevent him from stepping naked into the tub, she scooped up a lamp and fled to her room. She tiptoed up the main staircase to the first floor, then up the second, narrower flight of stairs to the attics high above the street. One room was used as a storeroom, the other was Elizabeth's, her first private room and her pride and joy. Here, on a shelf Matt had made for her, stood a few books that Rachel Montgomery and Christian Selby had given her. There, on the wall, was a picture painted by James. This was where Elizabeth kept her few clothes, her hairbrush, her mirror. It was the middle of the night. In a few hours, she would have to be up again. She swept the lawn cap from her light brown hair and let the long, heavy tresses tumble down her back. She brushed it out, as she used to brush Rachel's hair, then took off her apron and gown and underclothes, putting them away neatly before slipping into bed in her shift. She knew that she would never be able to sleep. There was too much to think about. She blew out the lamp, then opened her eyes to the sound of the first risers moving about in the street below. It was time to get up. Chapter 2. The house was silent as Elizabeth hurried down to the ground floor. She was always first up, and it was her duty to have the housework started and breakfast ready before the men of the house arrived in the kitchen. She and Jane would normally have started work on the washing first thing, but the copper had been emptied for Adam Montgomery's bath. This meant that work would be behindhand all day. Trying to reorganise the day in her mind, she went into the kitchen, put the lamp on the table by the remains of Adam's meal, then turned and caught her breath. He was still there, fast asleep by the range, which now glowed dully. He had dressed himself again in his shirt, open at the neck to expose a strong throat, and his trousers. The stained jacket was thrown over his shoulders, and his bony bare feet sprawled untidily on the mat before the range. The hip bath had been put out of sight. She lit a second lamp and put it on the shelf above the fire. Its light fell across his face but didn't disturb him. He looked, she thought, very uncomfortable. His long frame spilled over the chair, his head lolling on one shoulder. Even in sleep, the set of his mouth was uncompromising, though the dark lashes brushing his cheeks were surprisingly long and silky. His hair was disordered, and she saw in the light that there were threads of silver among the black curls over his temples. One arm lay across his body, the other was over the wooden arm of the chair, his fingers dangling in midair. He had fine hands, she thought, enviously, aware of her own work-reddened fingers. But then, Adam Montgomery was both a physician and a surgeon. Where she suddenly realised that it was almost 6, and nothing had been started. She was torn between reluctance to wake him and the urgency of her work. Nervously, she spoke his name, but he didn't stir. Her hand reached out towards his arm, hesitated, withdrew, and finally settled. His body was strong and hard beneath the soiled material of the shirt. She shook him slightly, saying his name in a louder voice, and his dark blue eyes suddenly flew open. For a moment he stared, uncomprehendingly, at the hand on his arm. Then he said sleepily, "Who?" and lifted his chin to look up at her. "Oh, it's you." He rubbed a hand over his face. "What is it?" "It's nearly 6, sir. I have to clean the range and get the meal ready." He brushed her aside and got to his feet, yawning, stretching till his knuckles almost touched the ceiling, then looked with distaste at the clothes he wore. "Did my boxes arrive?" "Aye, sir, they're in your room." He nodded, picked up his jacket from the floor, where it had fallen, and went to the door. Then he turned, supporting himself with one hand on the frame. "How do you address my brothers?" "By their given names." "Then you'll call me Adam," he said, making an order of it, and walked out. Jane was buried in blankets, her hair a rumpled black mass on the pillow, mouth open, eyes tightly shut. Elizabeth shook her awake, with a lot more vigour and a lot less sympathy than she had used on Adam, and dragged her, protesting, to the cold floor. Then she hurried back to the kitchen, where she scooped up the remains of the late meal, cleaned out the grate with noisy speed, and set the fire. Jean shuffled in, sleepy-eyed and yawning, and was ruthlessly ordered to wash her face in a bowl of cold water, And stir yourself, girl, for there's porridge to make and the front doorstep to clean, and see you get a good polish on that door knocker. Set out the dishes first. I'll have to see what can be done about the washing. The flurry of orders set Jean in action, and Elizabeth hurried across the yard, still dark and cold. As she whirled through the wash-house door, she realised with surprise that the place was warm. Someone had stoked up the fire beneath the boiler during the night. She lifted the top of the boiler and found that it had been refilled, and the water was steaming gently, ready for the morning's wash. When Adam joined the family for breakfast, he had changed into dark trousers, strapped beneath the foot, and a clean white shirt under a red-patterned satin waistcoat. He looked as though he had enjoyed a good night's sleep. Rab was distant towards him at first, obviously still angry at being forced to return home alone to face his guests. If he had hoped to shame his son into an apology, he didn't succeed. Adam greeted them all cheerfully and launched into answers to his brother's clamoured questions without giving his father a second look. Elizabeth, apparently busy about her work, listened avidly. Adam had been a naval surgeon for the past 6 or 7 years, and the stories he had to tell filled her with astonishment. She was vaguely aware that there was a world outside Paisley, but never before had she heard a first-hand account of beaches of white sand, dark-skinned peoples, continuously blue skies, tremendous heat, or the sight of the sea stretching to every horizon. She could visualise each picture as he described it.
And where did you get to last night?
Rab finally asked.
The coach knocked a man over in the dark. I saw to it that he got home and dressed his injured leg. A drunken fool, I've no doubt. Aye, he was drunk, but a man in drink can bleed and suffer as much as an abstainer once he's been hurt. I was left to explain your absence to your friends.
Adam raised those compelling dark blue eyes from his plate.
Your friends, father, he corrected calmly. I'm sure you managed fine without me. But you're as ill-mannered as ever you were. Have you learned nothing in the 7 years?